All right, everyone, we're moving into Chapter 6 where we're continuing to talk about memory, but we're now going to be looking at long-term memory. So when we think about long-term memory, this is our archive of information about past events. So we're moving out of the short-term and sensory memory phase where we're now looking at things that are 30 seconds or more ago. So this does tend to work closely with working memory, so information can move freely between long-term and short-term and working memory, and they kind of feed into one another. But long-term memory indicates that we've held on to something long-term, that we can recall it, and that it hasn't decayed before it got stored. So it could literally just be a few moments ago to as far back as we can remember in life. And what we're going to see as we progress throughout the chapter here, and looking at some of the highlights, is that over time we do experience that decay, especially if we haven't accessed information in a long time. So the more recent memories are going to be more detailed than those that are more remote. So if we take a look here at the student here, there's a very vague memory that I remember my elementary school. So maybe you remember some vague names of teachers or just being around the halls, but maybe not exactly what the curriculum was in your second grade classroom, something like that. So then, as we move closer into the future, there are more detailed memories here. So I was shopping for clothes, so you're going to remember which stores you went into, what things you tried on. And then I was walking to class recently, and then I just sat down. So this would be in short-term memory, and really anything before walking into the classroom is technically long-term memory. So that's the way we're going to define that. All right, so one of the concepts we want to make sure to nail down is serial position. So in terms of long-term memory here versus short-term memory, again, short-term being really anything under 30 seconds here. This was studied initially by word list reading. So you would read a word list, and there's one in your text that I'd encourage you to check out and give it a try. But what you would do is you would read the list, and you would either recall as much as you could immediately, either through stating the words or writing them down. This is usually best done by verbal recognition because the act of writing something down takes longer. So then we're actually not getting the most accurate reading of what the person remembered, but more how quickly can they write things down. So if you're answering verbally, looking at a curve like this, you can get a sense for the primacy effect and the recency effect, and these have to do with what information can we recall from the list and how well can we recall it. So the primacy effect tells us that if we read a word list, we're more likely to recall information that was earlier on in the list. And if we look at the recency effect, we're more likely to recall information from the end. And there are different reasons for these, but what we see for all of the information in the middle, if we think about each of these dots maybe as a word that we tried to remember, what we're going to learn is that information that's in the middle is going to be lost because at the beginning we've logged some of these away in short-term memory. Maybe we're doing rehearsal, intentional rehearsal, that control process we talked about last time. And with recency effect, we see a lot of words that we can recall because we just heard them. So they're actually still in our short-term memory. All right, so I'd encourage you to give that a try just to get a sense for it yourself and see how much your memory decays for those words, especially in the middle of the list. Now, as we say that, one of the things you may encounter is that because you're anticipating forgetting those middle words, you may actually find yourself attending to those. So that may actually mess up your curve. But that's why in research we wouldn't tell anyone what we were intending to find or what our hypothesis was. So we just talked about this here. So if we're looking at primacy effect, the triangles here are the rehearsal curve here. So this is how many times that the subject has said each word on the list. So if you read the list continuously, you'd be saying each of these words multiple times. And so as you get to the last word, you're only saying it, say, one time because you've got to the end of the list. So you're more likely to remember these words because you've had time to rehearse. And again, as we said before, you're more likely to remember these not because you said them several times, but because they're so close in your memory. They happened moments ago. So the recency effect here is important, and we can get a sense for this when we look at time delay. So if we take a look at this curve here, we see the red line with no delay. We see again the primacy effect and the recency effect, where there is a bump up in what is remembered at the beginning and the end of the list. But if we take a look at our curve here with the triangles and the dotted lines for a 30-second time delay, we only see the primacy effect here. So this becomes important for, say, advertising or political campaigns. So early on in a campaign, they're trying to be the first to get their message out because we are more likely to remember something that happened earlier. So the first stimulus that we encounter, maybe it's a political ad or something, that's going to stick in our mind better than something that happens, if they're doing a 2-year presidential campaign. What we hear in the first couple of weeks of the campaign is going to form our initial impression. And then over those 2 years, we're going to have a lot of garbage in there. We're going to have so much information we're bombarded with, we're going to forget most of it. And then at the very end, you'll notice a big spike, a big bump in how much people are spending on ads. And that's because of this recency effect. And they're banking on the last thing that we hear being very influential on us. So if you're running a campaign or if you're advertising a product, you want to get your product out there quickly and then continue the message so people have continual influence. And then right before your product is launched, you want to remind them again, hey, this was important. So that is part of why we remember things at the beginning and at the end. So is it rehearsal? Is it that it's still in short-term memory, like in the recency effect? So part of that has to do with, is there a time delay between when we need to remember something and when we heard it? All right. So we're going to take a look in this chapter also at how does information get coded. So last chapter we talked about visual and auditory encoding, and we had the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad. But when we get into long-term memory, we're looking at semantic coding. In a lot of ways, we're looking at what is the meaning of something. Have we attached a time significance to something? So there are different types of encoding we're going to encounter. And one of the ways that we can see this in effect is that if we take a look at 4 very similarly based groups of words, these are all fruits, all types of food here, and specifically fruit. These are competing types of information. So we're not going to remember these all equally. And by the time we get to the end here, there's so much competing information, we're only going to remember the first group really well, and then the rest will be kind of muddled. But if we take a look here at these types of jobs or careers, we're going to remember the first box pretty well, primacy effect most likely here. And then when we get to the end of the fourth box is very different, a different semantic or type of meaning, then we're likely to remember this group as well. So there's less interference for that final group because it's different semantically. It's a different type of group. So semantic coding in memory has to do in part with meaning. Oftentimes it's some kind of cultural significance or emotional significance. We're going to talk about semantic memory as a type of declarative memory a little bit. But then we've also got recognition memory. So this happens, say, when you're taking a multiple choice test and you aren't able to bring it up because you remember a meaning about it. You're not able to do what we call recall memory, maybe, but you are able to, hopefully, when it comes to multiple choice, at least recognize the answer. So recall is definitely a more difficult task, and I would encourage you as you're studying for tests to try to make the studying process as recall-based as possible, so that when you finally get to a multiple choice question, you can answer it without actually having to recognize the answers because you might get fooled. So recognition memory here just has to do with identification of a previously encountered stimulus, meaning I've seen this before, I recognize it. And in terms of where is memory located in the brain, so we've talked kind of more vaguely about whether it has meaning attached to it, something like that, but really there are locations in the brain that house memory, and memories are often encoded in networks of neurons. So it's not typically one neuron that if it dies, your memory is gone for that event. But because there are different types of memory involved, whether it's physiological or procedural memory, as well as semantic and episodic memory that we'll talk about later, memories are housed in various locations and across networks of various locations, excuse me, and across different networks of neurons. But there are concentrated areas within the brain where we're going to find a lot of these neurons. And part of the way we found out about this is through individuals who have had particular disorders. So the hippocampus is largely responsible for your ability to encode new long-term memories. Now, that's not where they're consolidated and stored, but they tend to be at least encoded in the hippocampus. So we learn about this by experiencing patients who have had damage to the brain. That's often how we actually end up learning about the brain, is people who have damage to particular locations. So one way I like to remember this is, you've probably heard an elephant never forgets. Well, the way that I initially remembered that the hippocampus is where memories get encoded for long-term storage is, I took that elephant thing and I said a hippo never forgets. So another large land mammal, I believe it's the third largest land mammal. So the hippo never forgets. So the hippocampus is responsible for encoding long-term memories for storage. So we learned this through looking at patient HM who had surgery for epilepsy, and they removed and destroyed part of the hippocampus, a lot of it. Patient CW had viral encephalitis. KF had a brain injury to the parietal lobe. So these are all injuries that would impact the ability to store information. So let's take a look at what happened for them. So what happened for HM and CW is that their short-term memory was impaired, was okay, but their long-term memory was impaired. And then for patient KF, and if you remember KF here had the parietal lobe, which is where our part of our motor cortex is housed. Patient KF had impaired short-term memory, but okay long-term memory. And so what do we learn from this? Well, we're back to this idea of double dissociation. So short-term memory and long-term memory have what's called a double dissociation. And really what that means, essentially, is that these two entities function separately. So they're likely housed separately from each other, meaning if we damage the hippocampus, like with patient HM and CW, the hippocampus means, damage to the hippocampus means you're still going to be okay with your short-term and immediate memory, or sensory memory. But your long-term memory, that ability to encode long-term information, is going to be impaired. And that's just the opposite with KF, who had the parietal lobe damage. So important that we see this double dissociation, that just because you lose one does not necessarily mean they're going to lose the other. All right, so let's talk different types of long-term memory. So our two basic types are explicit or declarative long-term memory, and this is conscious. So when someone says, what's 4 plus 7, you have to think, okay, 4 plus 7, 11. Okay, so you're able to come up with that. That's a fact, which would be semantic knowledge, which we'll get to. And then there's also implicit knowledge, and this is typically more procedural memory, or the how-tos. This is unconscious memory, so things we don't have to think about, like walking. It's just a skill that you have. All right, so let's take a look at these two broken down just a little bit more. Implicit or non-declarative versus explicit and declarative. Implicit, again, we said is unconscious, so we talked about skill memory, like walking, but this could also be something more complex, like how to type on a keyboard. Any chicken peckers out there? You take your keyboard and you take one finger on each hand and kind of peck around in hunt and peck mode, and that's as opposed to the more fluid using all 10 of your fingers to type on the QWERTY keyboard, and you don't have to think about it. So my son, the other day, I was typing something and he was impressed that I was typing some feedback for someone on a paper, and he said, "Wow, you're really good." And I'm not that great. I'm not a secretary. I'm reasonably fast for a non-secretarial type. But he was impressed because he has a hard time just looking for the first letter of his name on the keyboard. So for him, it's very conscious when he's typing. So we had him type out his name, and it took a good minute to type his name. And so then I showed him what it's like to just have knowledge of the keyboard, and he would talk, and I would type as he was talking, and pretty much keep up with him. But for me, the knowledge of the keyboard is implicit. It is a procedural skill memory. I know how to do it. I don't have to think about it anymore. But for him, it was explicit. He had to think about it. So we can further break down explicit memory or declarative memory into, we should change that. to conscious memory. A little error there. So explicit memory is for events and facts and knowledge, cultural knowledge, etc. So let's break down the declarative first, or our explicit memory first. So episodic, this has to do with memory for personal events. So you might remember your wedding, you might remember a talk that you went to recently, you might remember a song, something like that, so the words to the song. So that might help you to remember, when you're driving in the car one day. I don't know about you guys, but I will hear a song sometimes and I'll remember the first time I heard that song, and I'll remember, oh, I was driving on the street, I was about to turn right. So that is episodic. I'm remembering a time when I heard that song and exactly what was going on at that time. Now, as time goes by, that will fade, and we'll talk more about that. But I'm remembering an event. Pardon me. Semantic, on the other hand, this is for facts and knowledge. Often it's without some kind of specific context. So this could be cultural knowledge. It could be things like who the 30th president of the United States was. Now, I can't remember who that was. But if I could, that would be factual knowledge. That would be semantic information. So episodic memory, our one branch of declarative memory here, episodic, involves mental time travel, meaning I can close my eyes and I can think back to a particular event in time. But the problem with this is that it's not guaranteed to be accurate. So oftentimes our mind will fill in the gaps for us, which is again why we don't want to trust eyewitness testimony as much as people like to. Because we can be 100% certain that something happened, but we may have filled in a lot of gaps and made up information. Not intending to. It's unconscious at that point. And then semantic memory, again for facts, does not necessarily involve mental time travel. You don't have to think back to when you learned who the president is. You just know that so-and-so is or was the president. You don't have to think back to when you learned that. And then, similar to short-term and long-term memory, we have episodic and semantic memory also showing a double dissociation. So again, we see that they can influence each other, but they're separately active. So with patient Casey, who had the damaged hippocampus, he had a difficult time with episodic memory, so he couldn't relive or think back to events from his life, which is really sad. But his semantic memory was intact, so he could remember information. So if you were to take an intelligence test that included questions like around what year was the Civil War going on, or who was the president during the Civil War, he could remember some facts about that. It's not when he was alive. So you could remember some facts about that. It's just something you learn from a book. But if he had been in a war, he would have very limited access to memories from that time, from particular battles that he might have been in. So very, very different here in terms of what can be remembered if there's damage to the hippocampus. So that's one example of how we might see that double dissociation. And then similarly here, you'll read about the quote-unquote Italian woman in your text, and she had impaired semantic memory, but was okay for memory of past events. So we see that there's this double dissociation in various patients that let us know that these two types of memory are related, and they are both helpful for us, but they're housed separately. So if you lose one, you don't necessarily lose the other. So this has also been shown not just through neuropsychological testing or just checking people's memory for particular events, but there's actually evidence from brain imaging studies that show that retrieving these different types of memories activate different areas of the brain. So we can see that this is housed differently. All right. Now, in terms of losing these memories, episodic memory can be lost, leaving only semantic memory. So, in this case, you might have a memory of your friend's wedding, but it may be only factual information about it. You might know that your friend is married, but you might have forgotten where the wedding took place. You might have forgotten what it was like to be there, what your favorite songs were that were playing. So you might have forgotten essentially the experience, but you would be left with the knowledge that your friend is still married. So you're left with just the facts of the situation. And very important for students here, semantic memory can be enhanced if it's associated with episodic memory. So if we combine them, these two parts of the brain that are housed separately that can work on the same types of information, we can actually influence recall. And so we've got personal semantic memory, which can include autobiographical memory, which is memory of specific experiences. So this personal semantic memory involves knowledge that has some kind of personal meaning, often some kind of affective or experiential meaning to it. So if we want to enhance, say, knowledge of something for your abnormal psychology class, you're trying to memorize psych disorders, I would say think about a person in your life who seems to have some of the features of the disorders that you're studying. So don't just memorize a list of symptoms and say, for major depressive disorder, you need to have a loss of interest in activities, or you need to have suicidal thoughts, or loss of appetite, or subjective experience of depression, depressed mood. Right? Instead of doing that, say, boy, my Uncle Larry was depressed for a while, and I remember when we were around him that he didn't seem to want to do anything, he lost his motivation, he just seemed really disappointed and sad all the time. Right? Think of a person that's going to bring it to mind. So that makes it more specific to you. It makes it more experiential. So you're bringing an episode from your life into it. So that time you went to Christmas and Uncle Larry was really sad, right? You've now got an experience, so you're more likely to remember that information. And then, of course, over time, if we don't continue to activate neural pathways, we tend to forget information. So the longer it is from the initial time of encoding to when we're trying to recall, the more it is we're likely to forget. So we might go through a progression like this where we might remember that something is familiar and the circumstance, but we don't remember all of the specific details, and we might go through a progression where we don't even remember the stimulus at all. So if we can think about an event like we talked about your friend's wedding, you might have immediately after the wedding all kinds of stories, and you share that with your friends, and you're posting on Facebook and Instagram all these photos, and everything was great, and you have all these memories, all these detailed memories of the experience. But over time, you just recall, I went there, and I think I had a good time. Right? Oh, your wedding was so much fun. Right? We should go do this thing again. We should go dancing again because I remember that was fun. But you may not actually remember dancing. You just remember that it was fun. Alright, so that was our declarative memory in its particular branches. Implicit memory is different here in that implicit memory tends to be unconscious. So we're not thinking about these types of memory. So it could be procedural memory, like how to ride a bike, how to drive a stick shift, how to type on a QWERTY keyboard. But you might also experience repetition priming and classical conditioning. So skill memory we've talked about. So we don't have to be conscious of these things. And it's actually interesting. People that can't form new long-term memories, like maybe they've had damage to their hippocampus, they can actually still learn new skills. And the reason for this is that these memories are housed in a different part of the brain. So whereas your explicit declarative memories are housed in the medial temporal lobe, and some other places, but they're housed largely in the temporal lobe. The skill-based knowledge, the how to move your body, how to manipulate an object, those are housed in areas that control motor functioning, so like the cerebellum and the parietal lobe. So pretty cool here. If you lose your memory, you can actually still learn some helpful skills, maybe to support yourself without being fully dependent on other people. So pretty neat that our brains are so diversified in terms of where information goes. By the way, that's one of the things when I think about how well we are designed. It's just really amazing to me because God has built in these safeguards for us where even if we get damage to a particular part of our brain, it's not an all is lost situation. It's not a total loss because we have this spreading out of the functions to different areas of the brain. And they all communicate with each other and they can help each other, but they can function independently in a lot of cases. All right, let's talk about repetition priming here. This is when we present one stimulus and it impacts performance on that stimulus when it's presented again. So priming essentially meaning that we've seen something before. So Graf et al. Tested explicit memory and implicit memory. And they were looking at a few different groups here. And they were looking at Korsakoff's patients. And Korsakoff syndrome is essentially a memory problem, amnesia, that results from a vitamin B deficiency that often happens when people have alcohol use disorder. So the patients who had Korsakoff syndrome had a related amnesia, and then we had patients who did not have amnesia but were still being treated for alcohol use disorder, and then also a third group of patients who had amnesia with no history of alcoholism. So on the next slide, we're going to take a look at the results here of their study. And so what they found is that the patients who, the subjects who did the worst were the amnesic patients who did not have a history of alcohol use disorder, and that we had similar functioning here on recall. And again, recall is just, can I recall information without being primed, without being given some kind of hint, in a sense. So think about priming almost like a hint to help you recall information. So without a hint, we had our amnestic patients doing poorly, and then similar performance between the inpatients with alcohol use disorder and alcohol use disorder without amnesia. And then when we get to an implicit memory test, what we see is that all of the groups did essentially the same, statistically the same. So when there was a primer, when there was a hint, in a sense, they were completing word stems. So instead of just recalling words, they were given a stem, so they were given the first few letters of a word, and most of them were able to come up with the correct word at the end. All right. So let's talk about what this looks like in everyday experience, because most of us are not completing word stems at our jobs and in school. So Perfect and Askew here came up with, which I think are fantastic names for researchers, by the way. But aside from that, they studied the propaganda effect. And so what they found is that people are more likely to believe something is true simply if they've heard it before. So you're more likely to believe something that someone says if you've heard it on the radio or heard it on television. One of my favorite examples of this, I remember I was home one day several years ago, and I was watching, it was daytime television, The Price is Right or something, and let's see, what was it? There was a lawyer that came on the TV, and he was talking about his group, his firm, and he said, "We're the lawyers that you've come to get this know and trust through our commercials over the last 20 plus years." So really, we've been getting propaganda from his firm. We're the best. You should call us instead of anybody else. We're going to help you the best. So he's sending out this propaganda, and he's basically telling you, you should believe me and trust me because you've seen me for so long. So just because you've seen me before, you should trust me more than some person who just hands you a business card on the street, when really we don't know anything about either one of them. So that's the propaganda effect, that if we see something, we're more likely to believe it's true. So if you are marketing to someone, market them like crazy. Make them see your product many times, because the more they see it, the more likely they are to buy into it. I mean, how many times have you seen a product on TV and you said, that's ridiculous, that there's no way that could work, or, I don't even see why anybody buys this. And yet, if you see it several more times, you think, well, that makeup does look better than my current makeup. Or, my headlights do need restoring. I bet that white new stuff is really amazing. And for all I know, maybe it is. I haven't used it. But you're more likely, if you see it more often, to believe that. All right, so the final thing here that we're going to talk about for this chapter in implicit memory is classical conditioning. So this is essentially pairing of stimuli. So a neutral stimulus, something that would not normally cause a reaction, gets paired with a reflexive response. So something like fear, salivation, anger. And if we compare a neutral stimulus with that reflexive response, we then have that reflexive response to that neutral stimulus instead of to whatever the naturally occurring stimulus would be. So we might see someone who's been through a trauma that has paired what really should be a neutral stimulus with a trauma response. So maybe they were watching maybe a Disney movie or something. Maybe they were at home with their kids watching The Little Mermaid and their house gets broken into while they're there. So maybe the next time they're watching The Little Mermaid, they have a really dramatic increase in their cortisol levels and they're feeling really stressed out and they're on edge and they don't know why. And if they stop and think about it, it's, oh my goodness, I was watching The Little Mermaid and this scene came on right before that burglar broke into our house, on the other side of our house, and we didn't know it and we were scared. Right? So that would be classical conditioning, where you're having a response that is not conscious. It's just happening to you, in a sense. All right, guys, that is all for Chapter 6 here. Those are our highlights. So read up on those. There's definitely other studies to take a look at and encourage you to check those out. But these are some of your key terms we want you to track down and be familiar with. And again, if there's one thing I can encourage you to do while you're studying, now that we've covered this especially, it's to make information personally meaningful. So as much as you can, make it episodic, right? Have some kind of event, some personal life story you can attach some of the factual information, the semantic information to, so that you can remember it. All right, take care.